slaughter, pending its prohibition and for related purposes.
The member for Denison.
Mr. Speaker, I move that this bill be now read a second time. Mr. Speaker, Australia is a wonderful place, and we certainly have a very high opinion of ourselves. Sometimes it's too high an opinion. Sometimes we think that we're a very civilised, ethical, law-abiding place. But the fact is, we have an animal welfare crisis in this country, Mr. Speaker. Now, some people might think, oh, I'm over-egging that a little bit, but I'm not. And I'm not just talking about the substantive matter that this bill concerns itself with in the live animal export trade. I'll get to the substantive matter shortly. But first of all, to speak to my point that we have an animal welfare crisis, let's look at some of the let's look at some of the facts. Take egg production. You know, we go to the supermarket now and we see lots of free-range eggs there on display. But the fact is that about half of the eggs sold in supermarkets currently are not free-range. And in fact, the majority of eggs in this country are actually used in the industrial production of food, and the vast majority of them are not free-range, produced by free-range hens. So the fact is that the vast majority of egg production in this country is from hens who are stuck in a little wire cage for their miserable life. And we say that we are an ethical country that treats animals well. And even those hens that are in so-called free-range conditions, the standards that's being applied to them is appalling. The industry thinks it's free-range to have 10,000 hens per hectare. That's one chook per square metre. That's not free-range by any reasonable measure. The standard should be no more than 1,500 hens per hectare. That would be much more to do with the ethical production of eggs. So that's the egg production. What about pork production? Now, yes, sow stalls are being phased out throughout the country, but it's interestingly that currently they are only banned. In two states. In Tasmania, or one state, Tasmania, and in the ACT. In the rest of the country, they're still legal. Well, thankfully the industry is phasing them out, but the industry refuses to phase out farrowing crates, which are themselves terribly cruel. They're not much bigger than the sow. There's no capacity for them to, with some straw to make a little home for themselves, to live any sort of half-decent life. What about greyhound racing? Now, there's been much said about greyhound racing, Speaker, in this country in recent times, and for one brief moment we thought the Premier of New South Wales would show, or the former Premier of New South Wales, would show a bit of backbone, respond to all of the evidence about the systemic cruelty in the greyhound racing industry, finally respond to the public concern about the cruelty, the fact that thousands, more than 10,000 healthy greyhounds are put down each year because they're not wanted or they don't run fast enough. The fact that live baiting, supposedly outboard, but widely conducted. Everyone in the industry knows that. Even the people that aren't directly involved in live baiting, they send their young dogs off to a breaker, and those people, the owners of those dogs, know full well what that breaker is getting up to and the fact that he or she is probably using live baiting. And we had that brief moment of hope when the former Premier of New South Wales said he'd do something about it. And the first time a bit of pressure was applied, the first time someone put a blowtorch to his feet, he turned to mush, turned to jelly and rolled over, and the opportunity was lost. What about thoroughbred racing? The fact that the whip is still allowed throughout this country. How on earth can whipping a horse, how on earth can that be ethical behaviour? It's cruel. And this nonsense about, well, we don't whip our horse, we won't win the race. But if no one's whipping, it's an even playing field, so to speak, and it would be fair. I mean, for heaven's sakes, if we do nothing else with thoroughbred racing, let's get rid of the whip. And what about steeplechase racing? It's still allowed in Victoria and South Australia, even though every year we see race after race, horse after horse, taking terrible tumbles, ending up in agony and having to be put down. How on earth, in a country like Australia in 2017, can we allow steeplechase racing? What about the puppy farms, the kitten farms? Something like 15% of the puppies and kittens sold in pet shops, or are sold in pet shops, and virtually all of them come from puppy farms and kitten farms. We know what goes on in those places, the cruelty. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is Australia in 2017, and we've got, the cruelty with the industrial production of eggs and pork, the cruelty in the greyhound racing industry, the cruelty in the thoroughbred racing industry, the cruelty in the steeplechase industry, the cruelty in the pet shops with the puppy farms. And now that brings me to the substantive matter, and the cruelty in the live animal export trade. How on earth can any civilised, decent country allow this barbaric behaviour to continue? In fact, not only is it continuing, but this government, and this Minister for Agriculture rubs his hands with glee and celebrates every expansion of the industry, sending shiploads of beef cattle now to China. And the government says, hurrah, this is fantastic. The Indonesians make it easier to send heavier cattle and a more reliable supply chain of beef cattle to Indonesia. And the government rubs its hands with glee. Hurrah! We're expanding the industry. Even though, Deputy Speaker, the live animal export industry is cruel and it's not in our self-interest and it does not have popular support. How many more exposés, Deputy Speaker, do we need? How many times do we need to turn on the television or look at the front page of the newspaper and see the cruelty before a government, any major party, finally does something about it? Yes, it was great that for a short time the trade with Indonesia was suspended by the Gillard Labor government, but it was only for 3 months and then it was resumed. And these days, the Labor and Liberal parties and the National Party are pretty much in lockstep with their support for the live animal export trade. How many times have we got to see live sheep buried alive? How many times have we got to see exposés of the cruelty in the slaughterhouses of Indonesia? How many more times have we got to see photos and footage of the conditions on the live export ships? What about those sheep coming out of an Australian winter and going to a Middle Eastern summer and ending up in the markets, illegal markets, during the Festival of Sacrifice? And what does the government say? Hurrah, we're expanding the industry. They don't care about animal welfare. If they cared about animal welfare, Deputy Speaker, they would back this bill. They would back this bill which would phase out and eventually ban the live animal export industry. It would be gone within 3 years, and that's got to be reasonable. I know a lot of people will criticise me and say it should be banned today, immediately. But I'll say, OK, industry, I'll cut you a bit of slack. You've got 3 years to prepare for the change. The condition is, though, that in the interim you've got to have much better animal welfare safeguards during those 3 years, and you've got 3 years to prepare for the industry to be wound up. And you know what? It'll be a better red meat industry in this country, because all of a sudden we won't be relying on a cheap product going overseas, no value added, an industry constantly under political pressure because of the systemic cruelty that is exposed week after week about what goes on in that industry. And let's not forget, Deputy Speaker, the live animal export industry benefits very, very few people. A relatively small number of big cattle producers in Northern Australia, a very small number of exporters, and the cost is the thousands of abattoir workers who have lost their jobs in this country. That's the cost, and the fact is we should be processing those animals in Australia. And it's cock and bull, Deputy Speaker. It is a complete lie for the industry to say there is no alternative. Of course there's alternatives. We export an enormous amount of chilled and frozen red meat to the Middle East and into Malaysia and in Indonesia. It is complete baloney to say that these countries, because of their religious practices, can only accept live animals and slaughter themselves. We have a number of abattoirs in this country who are already licensed to slaughter animals consistent with religious practices. These Islamic countries are already buying enormous amounts of value-added red meat that's been processed in this country. It has employed Australian workers, and it's been done relatively ethically to world's best standards in this country. As opposed to, we throw all these thousands of sheep, thousands of cattle on these huge boats in the most appalling conditions, and we let them sail off into the sunset. And who cares about the conditions when they get to the feedlots and the conditions in the slaughterhouses? Deputy Speaker, it is way beyond time. I think half a dozen or so bills I've now sought to move in this place, and almost none of them have had the agreement of the government or the alternative government to be debated. Let's at least get behind this one. Let's at least debate it and let's vote on it. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member for Denison. Is the motion seconded? I call the member for Melbourne.
Mr Deputy